It was supposed to be a day of celebration, yet fate had other plans. The sun had barely risen when I found myself lying in a hospital bed, pain coursing through my body, and memories of the past few hours haunting my thoughts. My husband, Bruno, had always been my rock, the man I believed would stand by me through anything. But on what should have been a joyous occasion, my world was shattered in ways I never imagined. Everything started with a simple, innocent gesture. Bruno had promised to spend the day with me, to make this birthday one to remember. Instead, a single phone call changed everything. Camille, the woman who had always lingered like a shadow in our marriage, needed him. Without hesitation, Bruno rushed to her side, leaving me behind in more ways than one. What followed was a chain of events that would test the very core of my being, revealing truths I wasn't prepared to face. When the anesthesia wore off, the pain hit me like a tidal wave. Lying in the hospital bed, pale and trembling from the agony in my chest, I couldn't stop a video from looping on my phone. It showed the scene of the accident, where a man saved a woman, their gazes locked in what appeared to be a moment of true love. The comments praised their connection, calling it a perfect match. If that hero weren't my husband, Bruno, and if I hadn't been the one unconscious at the scene, I might have offered my blessings too. Self-destructively, I kept replaying the video until I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. Today was my birthday, and Bruno had promised to celebrate with me. But when Camille mentioned feeling a bit uncomfortable, he turned around and rushed to pick her up, causing the accident on the way to the hospital. Camille was only frightened thanks to Bruno's timely protection, but I had been trapped in the deformed back seat, bleeding profusely from a sharp pain in my lower abdomen until I lost consciousness. When I cried out for his help, he coldly reminded me that Millie is pregnant. There are 2 lives. Margaret, can't you be more sensible? I was stunned, covered in blood, as he ran to Camille without looking back, telling her not to panic. His gentle, trembling voice showed how afraid he was that she might be hurt. The smell of gasoline overwhelmed me, and I passed out. I survived, but at a terrible cost. Stroking my aching lower abdomen, I smiled self-deprecatingly and turned off the video. For a moment, everything seemed meaningless. Later that night, I woke up again from the pain and went to get some painkillers, only to bump into Bruno in the corridor. Despite it being after hours, he was still in his white coat, looking weary. I calmly asked, "Were you with Camille?" He looked at me expressionlessly and said, "Margaret, I don't have time for your nonsense." He spoke so steadily, without a hint of guilt, but I could smell the gardenia perfume that Camille loved clinging to him. How close must they have been for the scent to linger like that? Looking at Bruno, I suddenly felt nothing. "Let's get a divorce," I said. "Margaret, what are you making a fuss about this time?" Bruno's face changed, his tone impatient. "Just because I didn't celebrate your birthday?" I didn't answer, but he assumed it was the reason, his lips curling into a cold smile. "Millie is having a hard time with her pregnancy. As a friend, what's wrong with me taking care of her a bit more? You're just being petty and overly dramatic." He was about to continue scolding me when his phone rang, and his stern face softened instantly. I didn't need to guess who it was. It had to be Camille. He hastily said, "I've been really busy lately. I'll make up for your birthday another day," before leaving without a second thought. Bruno was always like this. Every time he abandoned me for Camille, he would offer a sweet treat afterward to compensate. He couldn't see the pale hospital gown I was wearing or express any concern, even though I had almost died. His mind and eyes were full of Camille. I used to deceive myself in this marriage, binding myself in a cocoon, but now I was truly tired. I wiped away the coldness on my face and realized I no longer felt sad. No one would believe it if I said it, but Bruno was the one who pursued me initially. We met through a blind date, sharing similar hobbies. Later, after chatting in detail, we discovered that our parents had been friends for many years, so it felt natural to get married. I knew he had a first love, whom he had been with for 7 years, but I believed he would handle it well. I was naive. Ever since Camille returned to the country pregnant, my life turned upside down. The calm and composed Bruno I knew was gone. When I had a high fever, he accompanied Camille to the countryside to watch the stars. On our wedding anniversary, he went to fix the plumbing at Camille's house, leaving me alone in an empty restaurant. If I showed any hint of complaint, I was accused of being jealous. Although I was his wife, I became a secondary choice. But all the heartache and grievances of the future no longer concerned me. Before logging out of WeChat, I saw a message from the research director, urging me once again to go abroad for further study. She had mentioned it 6 months ago, but I had politely declined because I didn't want to leave Bruno. I just wanted a simple, stable life with him, but he couldn't fulfill even that small wish. I took a deep breath and called the director directly, asking, "Is the opportunity for overseas training still available?" The director was surprised but delighted and assured me it was. I immediately made an online appointment for a divorce application. This time, it was enough. The next afternoon, I packed my things and took a cab home. Exhausted, I entered the guest room and fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by knocking. It was Bruno's voice, filled with an unusual mix of urgency and annoyance. Reluctantly, I got up to open the door, and he stood there glaring at me angrily. "Why didn't you call me when you were discharged?" he asked, his brows deeply furrowed. I was surprised. "There was no need to bother you for something so trivial," I replied. "A car accident injury is trivial?" Bruno looked at me with reproachful eyes. "Margaret, did you harm yourself to spite me? How could you be so reckless?" In the past, I would have argued with him, but now I just smiled calmly. "You're overthinking it. The doctor said I had recovered well and allowed me to be discharged. Thanks for your concern." My attitude was polite but distant, and Bruno was stunned. He was about to speak when Camille's coquettish voice came from behind him. "Margaret, you're home. Why didn't you tell me?" Camille appeared in a skimpy nightdress, completely at ease as if she were the mistress of the house. Instinctively, I glanced at Bruno, who rubbed his nose, clearly uneasy. "Millie's house suddenly had a leak, and since she's pregnant, I couldn't leave her alone," he explained. "Pregnant women do need special care. I understand," I replied, smiling at him. Bruno was momentarily stunned by my reaction. I waited a while, seeing him still standing there, and then turned to go back to sleep. But Bruno suddenly grabbed my hand. "No, Margaret, I know you must be angry," he said. Now it was my turn to be stunned. I recalled the past when Camille called, and he would always go to her, never missing a call. We had countless arguments over this. I had cried, raged, and even scratched his face like a madwoman, but he remained unmoved. He would even scold me, saying, "A person with a dirty heart sees everything as dirty." But now, facing them again, I felt no emotion. I didn't love him anymore, so I didn't care. I politely withdrew my hand. "It's late. Don't overthink it." Bruno stared at his hand, paused midair, and then suddenly, Camille clutched her abdomen, her eyes red as if she might faint at any moment. "Millie," Bruno shouted, his brows full of anxiety. He held her in his arms and glared at me. "Margaret, I thought you'd change, but I was wrong. Being petty with a pregnant woman, aren't you afraid of karma?" With a loud bang, he left with Camille slamming the door behind him. Such things had happened many times before, but this time, I felt no waves in my heart. I went downstairs, made myself a late-night snack, ate too much, and couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, I accidentally saw Camille's post. She leaned intimately on Bruno's shoulder at the hospital, with Bruno gently stroking her protruding belly. The caption read, "My Bruno will be the best dad in the world." The comment section buzzed with congratulations, and some even tagged me to provoke me. I looked at my flat belly, a self-mocking smile on my lips, and lightly tapped the screen to reply, "Congratulations on getting what you wished for." In the following days, Bruno didn't come home, and I enjoyed the peace, focusing on my recovery. Meanwhile, I contacted a lawyer and got a divorce agreement drafted. Before I knew it, it was time for my follow-up appointment at the hospital. I didn't expect to run into Bruno there. The moment he saw me, his face turned cold. That post on Millie's WeChat was just a joke. You provoked her, and pregnant women are sensitive. If something happens to her and the baby, can you take responsibility? Bruno's words reminded me of painful memories I had tried to forget. The car accident, the blood, the unconsciousness, the doctor's sympathetic look, and the form I signed for the induced labor. I stood frozen, my heart feeling as if it were being torn apart. Bruno assumed I felt guilty and grabbed my hand. "Today, you must apologize to Millie and get her forgiveness." Though I had been resting for several days, The miscarriage caused by the accident had left me weak and exhausted. Bruno forcibly dragged me into Camille's hospital room, where people greeted me with disdainful looks. Camille casually mentioned wanting to eat mangoes, and Bruno, who normally didn't like eating fruit, patiently peeled a whole plate for her, a treatment I had never received. Witnessing this, I remained calm. We were getting divorced. It had nothing to do with me. Camille, as if just realizing it, teased Bruno. "Come on, Bruno, you're so good to me. Margaret must be dying of jealousy." Bruno stopped what he was doing, glanced at me, and sneered coldly. "Can't you do things yourself without me reminding you?" He tossed a mango at me, which I instinctively caught and placed on the side table. Seeing my actions, Bruno looked momentarily stunned. I knew he was surprised that I didn't react as he expected. Someone rolled their eyes and said, "Oh, she's gotten smarter, knows how to retreat to advance." What a tactic! Bruno's stern expression softened a bit, but I remained indifferent, staring out the window. Camille's eyes glistened with tears as she cautiously said, "Margaret, if you mind, you can have all these mangoes." Her pitiful act made me look like the bad guy. Camille's usual tactic was to provoke me, waiting for Bruno to scold me, but I no longer cared. I smiled calmly, stood up, and was about to leave when Bruno suddenly blocked my way. "Margaret, why aren't you angry?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" I looked at him in confusion. His gaze became frantic. "I'm taking such good care of Millie. Doesn't it bother you?" I replied politely, "You're friends. It's reasonable to care for each other." "No, it's not reasonable." Bruno pressed his lips tightly, his eyes reddening at the corners. "Why are you ignoring me, not getting jealous? You weren't like this before." Camille's expression nearly broke beside us, and she tried to interject, but Bruno uncharacteristically shouted at her, stunning everyone, including me. The commotion caught the attention of the ward doctor, who seemed familiar. He was the doctor who had urgently treated me after the car accident. Upon entering, he first asked me with concern, "Miss Gu, how have you been? Any more vaginal bleeding?" Before I could speak, Camille exclaimed in shock, "Vaginal bleeding? Margaret, do you have some kind of disease?" She looked innocent and surprised, but her eyes were filled with malice, attracting the attention of passers-by outside the door. The gazes directed at me were full of mockery and undisguised humiliation. But the doctor scolded Camille, explaining that vaginal bleeding in women could be a normal physiological phenomenon and that she should stop misleading people. He then turned to Bruno, reproaching him. "Dr. Liu, your wife just had a miscarriage from a car accident. Her body is weak. How can you lose your temper at her as her husband?" The ward doctor didn't stay long and left after a few admonishments. But even after 5 minutes, the room remained deathly silent. Finally, Bruno broke the silence. "You were pregnant and had a miscarriage. Margaret, why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice filled with shock and anger. "There was no need. I could handle it myself," I replied lightly. That little life was gone. There was no point in saying more. Seeing my indifferent expression, Bruno suddenly got angry. "Margaret, that was my child too. How can you say it was unnecessary?" His voice was hoarse, his face filled with disbelief. Meeting his red-rimmed eyes, I sneered. "Are those crocodile tears?" I hadn't intended to mention the child. Our marriage was beyond saving, and a child wouldn't change that. I didn't want to disturb the child's peace or let them become a topic in a failed relationship. But Bruno brought this on himself. I didn't mind cutting him with words, letting him taste the pain I felt. "When the car accident happened, you were there. I was lying in a pool of blood, my knees full of glass shards, begging you to save me. Bruno, what were you doing?" Seeing his trembling eyes, I smiled lightly. "Oh, I remember. You saved Camille, who was unscathed and only a little frightened. You made your choice, so why blame me? Besides, taking a step back, Camille is pregnant. As long as you're willing, having more people call you dad wouldn't be a loss, right?" Bruno was speechless, his body trembling, his fists clenched tightly. At that moment, Camille suddenly exclaimed, "Margaret, I didn't expect you to go through something like this. As a mother myself, I know how painful it is to lose a child. You must be very sad about your miscarriage." She gently stroked her protruding belly, her seemingly sympathetic expression hiding a clear smile. As compensation, why don't you become the godmother of my baby? Bruno cares so much about this baby. If you treat this child as your own, it might ease your pain of losing yours." Camille's words ignited a long dormant anger in me. I walked up to her bed, raised my arm high, and slapped her hard. "Ah!" she cried out, stumbling onto the bed, holding her face in disbelief. "I used to ignore you because a fly won't land on an egg without cracks. Bruno couldn't control himself. I'm not someone who teaches wives or enjoys dealing with mistresses. Your repeated provocations are childish, but you should never have insulted my child. If it happens again, it won't be solved with just a slap." I smirked, then picked up the plate of mangoes and walked up to Bruno. Raising my wrist, I gently tipped the plate, pouring the fruit all over Bruno. His clean white coat became a mess. "Do you know why I didn't take the mango?" I wiped away the mockery in my eyes and looked at Bruno, speaking each word clearly. "Because I'm allergic to it. I had a reaction in front of you on our first date. If you can't even remember what your wife eats, don't pretend to care." Enjoying the sight of his suddenly pale face, I laughed heartily. "Stop being so hypocritical, Dr. Liu." Before leaving, I casually left the divorce papers behind, then went for my follow-up appointment. Bruno, surprisingly stubborn, insisted on accompanying me. "I don't accept the divorce. I'm your husband, Margaret. I have that right." I didn't bother arguing with him, prioritizing my health. After the examination, the attending doctor said I was recovering well. Hearing this, Bruno let out a sigh of relief, showing a relieved expression. He then took the initiative to pay the bills and get the medication. I watched coldly, not refusing free labor. Even when I was about to call a cab home, he insisted on driving me. "Margaret, given your condition, I'm worried." He glanced at me cautiously, as if I were a fragile porcelain doll needing careful handling. Before I could respond, an elderly lady passing by suddenly called out to him, "Dr. Liu? It really is you, Dr. Liu." Seeing Bruno's surprised look, she smiled even more warmly. "Don't you remember me? I was your patient. When your wife was pregnant and hospitalized, I was in the bed next to hers. Oh my, I've never seen a man as wonderful as you, Dr. Liu. Despite your busy schedule, you always found time to be with your wife, serving her tea, massaging her cramping legs. It made me so envious. I hope my daughter finds a husband as caring as you when she gets married," the lady rambled on. Bruno was initially stunned, then looked at me in panic. His face was full of fear and anxiety. I listened calmly, feeling the weight of Bruno's meticulous care for Camille. After chatting for a good 5 minutes, the lady finally noticed me standing there. "Oh, is this one of your patients, Dr. Liu? Oh, I'm so sorry for holding you up." I smiled but said nothing, not wanting to be associated with Bruno. We would soon be strangers after the divorce, but for some inexplicable reason, Bruno grabbed my hand, telling the lady earnestly, "No, this is my wife." "Oh, your wife. Wait, your wife?" The lady's face turned from shock to disdain. Her gaze towards Bruno quickly became filled with contempt. She forced a smile, and as she turned to leave, she muttered loud enough for all to hear, "Having a wife yet always hanging around a pregnant woman, he looks decent but is worse than a beast. Cheaters like him are everywhere. It's so disgusting." I couldn't understand Bruno's behavior. Why create trouble for himself? Was he insane? Still, he insisted on driving me home personally. "You just had a miscarriage. You need to take good care of your body, or you'll suffer long-term effects." Seeing his serious attitude, I nonchalantly agreed. A free driver is a free driver. Bruno told me to wait at the hospital entrance while he fetched the car from the parking lot. Before leaving, he tightly gripped my hand, pleading, "Wait for me 5 minutes, okay?" His usually cold eyes held a hint of desperation. I agreed, but after 10 minutes, there was still no sign of Bruno or his car. I glanced at my phone and opened a ride-hailing app. 15 minutes later, I was safely home, sipping a warm cup of milk when the door opened again. Bruno appeared, looking disheveled. "Just a little more time, Margaret. Why didn't you wait for me?" Why didn't I wait for him? Good question. Flipping through the documents in my hand, I didn't look up. "I did wait. You were late and broke your promise. But it was just a little more time. You went to see Camille, didn't you?" I cut him off abruptly. "Don't bother denying it. There's her lipstick on your collar." The mark was glaringly obvious, a blatant provocation. Camille had set the stage, and not fulfilling her plan would be a shame. Millie suddenly fainted and I was worried something might happen to her. Bruno's face showed undeniable panic. There's really nothing between us. You misunderstood. His hoarse voice carried a hint of barely perceptible grievance, as if I had caused him great sorrow. But I was the one truly suffering. I laughed bitterly, feeling an indescribable rage. You feel wronged over such a small thing? But Bruno, the pain I've endured because of you goes far beyond this. When we got married, you tearfully promised to make me happy for a lifetime. But in reality, all the suffering and humiliation I've endured were brought by you. 2 months ago, during a heavy rain, you volunteered to pick me up. But halfway there, Camille called, and you left me on the roadside. I walked in the rain for 2 hours, got a bacterial infection, and ended up in the hospital. A month ago, during a business trip, I encountered a local riot. I was so scared I took the earliest flight. 14 hours to get to you, seeking peace, only to find you hugging Camille, singing her a birthday song. A week ago, I was bleeding profusely, begging you to save me and our baby. I was so desperate. And what did I get in return? You took Camille and got on the ambulance without looking back, not even a word of concern. If it weren't for the firefighters arriving in time, I would have died in that gasoline-soaked inferno, leaving no chance to hear your petty grievances. Clenching my fists, I couldn't help but shout at Bruno, "Tell me, Bruno, what right do you have to complain to me?" Bruno stood frozen, his lips trembling, trying to speak but failing to say anything. I took a deep breath, ready to leave, but Bruno suddenly grabbed my wrist. "Margaret, I was wrong. I'm a bastard. You can hit me or scold me, but please don't divorce me. During the car accident, I didn't know you were pregnant. I thought it was just a minor injury. We can have more children in the future. I'll take good care of you. Give me a chance to make it right, please." My response was a slap, filled with all my hatred. "Bruno, you're a real scumbag." I laughed mockingly, tears streaming down my face. "So even now, you haven't looked at my medical records. If you had, you'd know that I was hemorrhaging badly when you abandoned me. I went into cardiac arrest shortly after getting on the operating table. To save my life, the doctors had to replace almost all my blood and even remove my uterus. And now you hypocritically tell me we can have more children? How am I supposed to have children?" With each of my accusatory words, Bruno's expression grew more frantic. By the end, he looked utterly devastated, as pale as a sheet. I scoffed, "If you truly feel guilty, remember to sign the divorce papers quickly and give me more money in the settlement." Leaving these words, I couldn't care less about Bruno's reaction. I went upstairs to rest, but Bruno seemed unwilling to give up. No matter how many times I reminded him, he still refused to sign the divorce papers. He started taking over my daily meals, bringing me a bouquet of fresh roses every morning. Wherever I went, he was a shadow I couldn't shake off. After 2 or 3 days of this, I couldn't tolerate it anymore. "Bruno, do you think this is meaningful?" My expression was cold, my tone filled with annoyance. "You're disturbing my life." "Are doctors so free these days?" Bruno pressed his lips together and gave a bitter smile. "I've been suspended from the hospital." Someone had written an anonymous complaint accusing Bruno of having inappropriate relationships with patients. Moreover, his favoritism towards Camille at the hospital was exposed, leading to his suspension and investigation. One misstep, and all his years of hard work could be undone. But none of this mattered to me. Facing my calm and unperturbed gaze, Bruno forced a smile. "Now I just want to make it up to you." "Sure, I'll give you that chance." "Really?" Bruno's eyes momentarily lit up with hope. The next second, he fell into despair. "Sign the divorce papers." I coldly shattered his illusions. "If you won't, after 2 years of separation, I can still file for divorce." I had once been blinded by love, suffering deeply. Now I was finally clear-headed. No one could stop me from moving forward. "Margaret, I know I hurt you deeply before, but I truly realize my mistakes. Can't you give me a chance to make amends?" Bruno looked at me helplessly, his eyes full of regret. I stared at him indifferently. "Can you give me back my child?" After enduring the abortion, I always thought I was strong enough to get through this ordeal. But every night, There was always the sound of a child crying echoing in my ears. I woke up from nightmares repeatedly, drenching my pillow with tears. Rationally, I comforted myself, telling myself that losing the baby was the best choice. This child came too suddenly. There was no future in my relationship with Bruno. Bringing the baby into a loveless family wouldn't be fair to him. Moreover, this child was lost in an accident. I didn't have to bear the guilt of killing him with my own hands. But the uncontrollable sobbing was real. The countless sleepless nights were real. The many donations I made to temples for longevity lamps weren't fake either. Despite all my self-deception, I still couldn't forgive myself. I felt like an unfit mother, hating myself for losing a life due to my carelessness. Before I could even embrace the sudden joy, I had to taste the pain of separation. I hated myself, and I hated Bruno even more. Countless times, I imagined that if I had been rescued first that day, would the child who was destined never to be mine have safely entered this world? Would he have been a lively, active boy, or a little girl who looked like me? I'll never know. That night, Bruno stood in the living room all night. When I woke up the next morning, I found the floor downstairs littered with cigarette butts and a divorce agreement with his signature on it. After finalizing the documents, I headed straight to the airport without hesitation, embarking on a future that belonged only to me. Daily training and study kept me incredibly busy. By the time I had settled down completely, half a year had passed. I reconnected with old friends back home and got an unexpected piece of gossip. Margaret, you wouldn't believe how miserable Camille's life is now. After the divorce, I announced it on social media, saying that the feelings have faded and we're returning to being friends. There was no need to be too harsh in the adult world. But Camille couldn't resist flaunting and provoking. A busybody dug up the dirt on her and Bruno. Not all friends were as clueless and brainless as their mutual friends. Many were indignant and stood up for me. Suddenly, their reputations were in shambles. Just as Camille was about to give birth, the child's father was finally identified. A wealthy woman came forward, accusing Camille of being a shameless mistress and had people beat her until she miscarried and bled profusely. In her final month of pregnancy, it was touch and go whether she would survive. Even though the doctors saved Camille's life, the baby was gone. She was left with permanent damage, bedridden for life. She didn't even have a chance to seek justice. That wealthy woman was ruthless, using mentally unstable people to attack Camille. A few medical records let them easily escape prison time. As for Bruno, he was caught by the disciplinary committee amidst the chaos and dismissed. No one knows where he's working now, probably some obscure clinic as an assistant. His life is reportedly even more miserable and humiliating, but none of this matters to me anymore. After hearing the gossip, I stretched and continued to immerse myself in my studies. After that, I heard no more news from home.